You never signed it. No lawyer read it aloud. No court asked for your consent. But from the moment you were born, it was there. The rules, the roles, the expectations, everything from how you speak to who you're supposed to be. Most of it never questioned, because questioning it makes you the problem. You walk into a classroom and sit in rows. You learn what's acceptable, what gets punished, what earns applause. You grow up, find work, pay taxes, vote when you're told it matters, nod when the system says you chose this. But somewhere deep down, a quieter question lingers. Did I ever agree to this life, or was I trained to call it mine? This isn't about conspiracy. It's about structure. A contract doesn't need a pen when the whole world enforces it. Parents pass it down. Schools hardwire it. Jobs, media, social norms, each one shaping you by silent design. And because it feels normal, it feels invisible. You think you're choosing, you're not. You're complying, not because you're weak, because the system is built to make rebellion look like madness. What we call society is a web of unspoken terms, terms that favor stability over truth, order over honesty, predictability over freedom. The philosophers called it a social contract. But it's grown into something else, something messier. Less an agreement, more a system of quiet enforcement. A way of life that rewards obedience with safety and questions with exile. So here's the real question. If you never signed this contract, why do you keep living like you did? Let's talk about that. The idea of a social contract didn't begin in modern politics. It began in fear. Hobbes looked at humanity and saw chaos, selfishness, violence, the constant threat of war. In his view, freedom without control meant death. So people gave up their liberty, not out of trust, but out of desperation. They handed power to a sovereign in exchange for order, safety at the cost of autonomy. Locke disagreed. He believed people could reason, could coexist without descending into madness. But even he saw the need for structure. For him, the contract was a tool, not to dominate, but to protect. A government built on consent, meant to defend life, liberty, and property. Not all control is tyranny, he argued. Some control is necessary to keep thieves from taking what's yours. Still, Locke left a warning. When the government no longer protects your rights, you not only can rebel, you must. Then came Rousseau. More radical. He believed that real freedom didn't exist in isolation, but in unity. You are only free, he said, when you follow laws you helped create. Not the laws of a king, not the laws of a market, the laws of the people, the general will. But Rousseau's vision came with a catch. If someone refuses to follow the general will, they must be forced to be free. Obedience wasn't just expected, it was righteous. Each of these thinkers tried to solve the same problem. How do you keep people from destroying each other without destroying their freedom in the process? Hobbes leaned on fear. Locke leaned on trust. Rousseau leaned on collective will. But all three agreed on one thing. Life without a shared contract is unstable, dangerous, unsustainable. What none of them could see was how that contract would change over time, that it wouldn't just come from the state. It would start to come from companies, screens, ideologies, culture. The sovereign power Hobbes feared became the algorithm. The democratic choice Locke cherished became marketing. The collective will Rousseau praised became groupthink. They gave us a lens, but the world we're looking at now is something else entirely. Ask most people what the social contract means and they'll point to laws, speed limits, taxes, voting, jury duty. Maybe they'll mention the Constitution or the idea of being a good citizen. It sounds straightforward. Give up a little freedom, get order and safety in return. A deal, a trade-off. But that's just the surface. That's the visible part. The version you're allowed to talk about without sounding paranoid. What's underneath is harder to name. It's not about laws, it's about norms, roles, expectations, the way you're taught to behave long before you know what politics even is. You're not told to sign a contract, you're shown how to act, and if you don't, you're corrected. Sometimes gently, sometimes not. It happens at home, in school, at work, online, and the message is always the same: comply or be punished, not by a ruler, by the group. It's not about justice, it's about predictability. A society runs smoother when everyone plays their part. So the rules don't just shape what you can do, they shape what you want to do. You're nudged, rewarded for fitting in, punished for stepping out. Eventually, you start policing yourself. That's what makes the surface so effective. It doesn't look like control, it looks like common sense. Of course you get a job. Of course you get married. Of course you stay polite even when you're furious. These aren't rules, they're just how things are. But that's the trick. When control looks like culture, no one sees the hand that's guiding them. This surface-level contract works because it hides in plain sight. And because questioning it is exhausting. It makes you an outsider, it makes people uncomfortable. So most choose the path of least resistance. Play along, keep moving, don't look too close. But the cost of that comfort is deeper than it looks. And once you see the surface for what it is, performance, pressure, quiet control, it becomes harder to pretend it's enough. Beneath the surface of rules and rituals, there's a deeper structure. It's not written, but it's everywhere. It tells you who gets listened to and who gets dismissed, who deserves empathy and who gets blamed, what kind of life is seen as respectable, and what kind of life gets quietly punished. This structure isn't enforced by police. It's enforced by expectation. It doesn't need laws, it needs repetition. Social norms passed down like family recipes. Cultural codes hidden in media, education, religion, finance. Systems that don't tell you what to think, but make sure you rarely think outside them. Start with identity. Who you're allowed to be is shaped long before you understand the word allowed. Gender, race, class. You're given a box, and everything around you reinforces that box. Try stepping out of it. Watch how fast the system pushes back. Maybe not with violence, just enough pressure to make you uncomfortable. To make you second-guess yourself. That's how compliance works. Then there's work. You're told it's freedom. That you can be anything, do anything, if you try hard enough. But the economy runs on constraint. Most people end up choosing from a list they didn't write, shaped by forces they don't control. Rent, debt, status, fear. The structure keeps you moving but limits where you can go. Even your opinions aren't as free as they feel. Media doesn't just inform, it frames. Platforms don't just connect, they filter. What you see, what you react to, what you think is important, it's curated. The system gives you two sides to pick from, then convinces you that choosing one is the same as freedom. This is how the modern social contract works. Not through open control, but through silent architecture. It trains you to play your role without needing to be told. It teaches you which compromises are just part of life. And it rewards the people who never stop to ask who built the game in the first place. You don't need a dictator to lose your freedom. You just need a system that makes obedience feel like your own idea. If the structure is so pervasive, why don't more people reject it? Because resistance isn't just difficult, it's disorienting. Most people aren't afraid of punishment. They're afraid of isolation, of being misunderstood, dismissed, cast out. The fear isn't violence, the fear is being alone with your truth. From childhood, you're taught to trust the group. Fitting in feels like safety. Standing out feels like danger. Even when the rules make no sense, there's comfort in following them. The moment you question them, you stop being part of the crowd. You become something else. And most people aren't ready for what that costs. Culture reinforces this. Heroes in stories break the rules, but only after they've been approved by the system. In real life, rule breakers are inconvenient. They're labeled angry, unstable, selfish. Institutions are built to absorb criticism, not change from it. And even when you point out something clearly broken, the system's first response is to pretend it's working just fine. Then there's fatigue. Questioning everything isn't romantic. It's exhausting. You still have bills to pay, people to care for, a life to manage. Most can't afford to live outside the system entirely, and so resistance becomes internal. Quiet. Compartmentalized. You see the cracks, but you keep going. You notice the manipulation, but you scroll past it. You feel the pressure, but you smile anyway. Even those who resist often end up building new versions of the same thing. New ideologies, new tribes, new codes of behavior, different labels, same structure. Because the deeper pattern hasn't been dismantled, it's just been dressed differently. That's the genius of the contract. It evolves. It adapts. It doesn't need to silence you. It just waits for you to exhaust yourself. And when you do, it welcomes you back. Not with punishment. With comfort, familiarity, relief. That's why so few escape. Not because they're blind, because the system is designed to wear down even the ones who see it. Eventually something changes. Not all at once. Not dramatically, Just a small crack, an instinct you can't unfeel, a quiet discomfort with how things are, the realization that the system doesn't need to be violent to be controlling. That conformity can feel safe even when it's slowly erasing you. This is the shift. You stop asking, is this normal? And start asking, who benefits from this being normal? You start seeing patterns, not in the headlines, but in the silences. The way dissent is managed, the way certain conversations never happen, the way comfort is used as a leash. You notice how often choice is offered without power. Vote, but only for what's already been filtered. Speak, but only in ways that won't get flagged. Work, but only within the limits set by someone else's profit model. The game starts to feel rigged, not by any single villain, but by the machinery itself. The shift doesn't make you louder. It makes you quieter. You watch more. You react less. You start to see control not as an event, but as a pattern. Not something that happens to you, but something you've been taught to replicate. On yourself and on others. You begin to ask different questions. Not just, what's wrong with this system, but what have I accepted without knowing it? You start to peel back the layers, where your beliefs came from, who taught you what success looks like, why you flinch at the thought of disappointing strangers. This isn't awakening, it's sobering. You don't feel enlightened, you feel heavier, not in despair, but in clarity. You see how deep the structure runs, not just around you, but inside you. The rules weren't just imposed, they were internalized, and unlearning them is a slower process than you'd hoped. But the shift has started. You can't go back to pretending you're free when you now see how thoroughly you were shaped. There's a rule you're never told, but you learn it anyway. Don't question the contract too loudly. You can critique the government, you can protest a policy, you can joke about politics at dinner. That's all fair game. What you can't do, what makes people uncomfortable, is question the premise. The system itself, the invisible agreement, the idea that this is the best we can do. That kind of doubt gets labeled dangerous, not because it's wrong, but because it's contagious. Once one person stops pretending the contract is fair, others might stop too. And the whole fragile sense of order starts to tremble. And that's how the contract survives. Not by law, but by consent. A consent that's manufactured, reinforced, expected. You can be skeptical, but only within the margins. Once you step outside the lines, you become the problem. Not because you're wrong, but because you're inconvenient. This is the real mechanism of control. Not overt oppression, not constant surveillance. Just a set of social signals that tell you where it's safe to speak and where silence is the price of inclusion. Everyone knows the rule. No one admits it exists, and that's what gives it power. So what do you do with all this? You're not going to dismantle the system overnight. You still need a paycheck. You still live in a world that rewards compliance. But there's power in understanding how the game is played, even if you still have to play it. Start with observation. Pay attention to the rules that shape your daily behavior, the ones no one had to say out loud. Notice when you censor yourself, when you play a role, when you default to what's expected. Ask yourself, is this survival or is this surrender? Look at the choices you're offered. Are they real? Or are they versions of the same thing dressed differently? Watch how media frames debate, how social pressure rewards shallow agreement, how institutions use language like freedom and choice while managing outcomes behind the scenes. You don't have to shout. You don't need to burn everything down. You can start by creating space between the instinct and the response. That pause, that 1 second before you act, is where your freedom lives. That's where you get to ask, do I believe this or was I trained to? Refuse automatic alignment. You can work a job without attaching your identity to it. You can use platforms without performing. You can participate without losing your shape. You don't have to reject society. You just stop pretending it's neutral. Build private clarity. Know what you stand for without needing applause. Know what you refuse without needing to explain it. A clear internal stance is harder to control than a loud public one. The system can manage noise. It struggles with silence that won't yield. And find others. Not to form a movement, just to compare notes. The pressure to conform weakens when you realize others feel it too. You don't need a revolution to reclaim your agency. You need awareness, discipline, and people you don't have to lie to. The contract doesn't disappear. But once you see it, it loses some of its grip. You can still move through the world. You just stop mistaking obedience for peace. You were born into a system. You didn't choose it, but you've been shaped by it every day since. Now you see it. Not all of it, maybe, but enough to know it's there. Enough to stop calling it freedom when it's really conditioning. Enough to stop calling it choice when it's really containment. This isn't about escape. There's nowhere to run that isn't touched by the same rules. It's about clarity. About moving through a rigged world with your eyes open. Quiet, unshaken, aware. The system wants your attention, your loyalty, your belief. It survives on reflex, on default settings, but you're not on autopilot anymore. So the question stays with you. Now that you see the contract, what will you stop signing?